In the sun-baked hallways of her Phoenix home, a 72-year-old grandmother was about to discover the most devastating betrayal of her life. What started as an early return from grocery shopping took a shocking turn when she overheard her beloved grandson plotting to steal her inheritance. Ruth Vasquez wasn't your typical elderly widow. For 30 years, she had built a construction empire, known for her sharp business instincts and fierce family loyalty. When she discovered Marcus and Sofia scheming behind closed doors, she realized she was facing a calculated betrayal that would test everything she believed about family, legacy, and the difference between inheriting wealth and inheriting values. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The midday Phoenix sun had turned the asphalt into a shimmering mirage when Ruth Vasquez pulled her silver Honda Civic into the driveway of the house she'd called home for 37 years. The grocery bags in her back seat rustled as she shifted the car into park, their contents, fresh produce from the Mexican market, Roberto's favorite brand of coffee that she still bought out of habit, and the ingredients for tonight's pozole, representing another weekly ritual in a life built on dependable routines. She'd left Fry's earlier than usual because of the construction on Camelback Road. The detour had taken her past the old neighborhood where she and Roberto had rented their first apartment in 1975, back when this part of Phoenix was still considered the outskirts, before the sprawl had swallowed up the orange groves and turned dirt roads into six-lane boulevards. The memories had followed her home like shadows, leaving her feeling both nostalgic and oddly unsettled. Ruth gathered the bags from the back seat, their weight familiar in her weathered hands. At 72, she moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that bodies were not meant to last forever. But her mind remained sharp, as the day she'd first stepped off the Greyhound bus from Guadalajara with $23 in her purse and Roberto's promise that they would build something lasting together. The house stood quiet in the afternoon heat, its adobe-style walls the color of desert sand, trimmed with the deep turquoise that Roberto had insisted would remind them of the Virgin's robes. The small front garden burst with prickly pear and beryl cacti, interspersed with the roses she'd never quite mastered but refused to give up on. It was a modest home by Phoenix standards, though Ruth knew its 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms represented more space than her own grandmother could have imagined. She fumbled with her keys at the front door, the metal hot enough to burn. The house should have been empty. Marcus had mentioned something about job interviews, though she'd noticed his enthusiasm for employment seemed to wane with each passing week since graduation. Sofia was supposed to be at her part-time job at the boutique in Scottsdale, the one Ruth suspected she'd obtained more for the employee discount than any genuine interest in retail. The cool air conditioning hit her like a blessing as she stepped inside, and she paused for a moment to let her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The living room looked exactly as she'd left it that morning. The family photos arranged on the mantelpiece, Roberto's reading chair still positioned at the perfect angle to catch the morning light, the hand-carved wooden cross that had been her wedding gift from her mother hanging above the television. Ruth moved toward the kitchen, intending to put away the groceries before they spoiled in the heat, when she heard voices drifting from the back of the house. Marcus's room. The words were muffled, but she could make out 2 distinct voices, one belonging to her grandson, the other to Sofia. They must have returned early as well. She was about to call out a greeting when something in their tone made her pause. There was an urgency to their conversation, a hushed quality that suggested secrets. Ruth found herself moving more quietly down the hallway, the grocery bags clutched against her chest like armor. "Told you. It's going to take time," Marcus was saying, his voice carrying through the closed bedroom door. "She's not stupid, you know. She built this whole life with my grandfather. She knows how to spot bullshit." "But that's exactly why we can't wait much longer," Sofia's voice, sharp with impatience. "My contact says these things get harder as they get older and more suspicious. Right now, she still trusts you completely. That's our window." Ruth felt her breath catch in her throat. The bags in her arms suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Marcus's voice carried a note she'd never heard before, something between guilt and frustration. Sometimes I look at her, and I remember how she used to make me eggs every morning before school, you know? How she never missed a single basketball game, even when her arthritis was killing her. Oh my God, Marcus. Sophia's laugh was cold, devoid of any warmth Ruth had ever heard in it before. Do you hear yourself? She was supposed to do those things. That's what guardians do. It's not like she had a choice after your parents died. The words hit Ruth like a physical blow. The grocery bag slipped from nerveless fingers, cans of tomatoes rolling across the hardwood floor with hollow, echoing sounds. "Keep your voice down," Marcus hissed, but he didn't contradict Sophia's statement. "Look, I get what you're saying, and you're right about the money thing. I've been thinking about what your cousin found in those property records. There's definitely more here than she's telling me about." "Exactly. That's what I've been trying to tell you. Your grandmother isn't just comfortable. She's wealthy. Those property holdings downtown, the investments your grandfather made. She's sitting on millions, Marcus. Millions that you're supposed to inherit anyway." Ruth pressed her back against the hallway wall, her heart hammering so hard she was certain they would hear it through the door. The family photos lining the hallway seemed to blur before her eyes. Marcus at 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning as she taught him to ride a bike. Marcus at graduation, his arm around her shoulders as they posed in front of the university sign. Marcus at Christmas just 6 months ago, helping her hang Roberto's old ornaments on the tree they decorated together every year since he'd come to live with her. "The thing is," Sophia continued, "why should you have to wait until she dies to get what's already rightfully yours? Especially when she's getting older and might start making questionable decisions about the money?" "What kind of questionable decisions?" "I don't know. Donating it all to the church, maybe? Setting up some kind of scholarship fund? Old people do weird things when they start thinking about legacy. But if the assets were transferred to you now, you could make sure they're properly managed." There was a pause, and Ruth could hear the sound of papers rustling. "These documents your cousin's friend prepared, they look legitimate?" "Completely. Power of attorney, property transfers, account authorizations. All you have to do is get her to sign them. Tell her it's for tax purposes, or insurance, or whatever. She trusts you enough that she won't read the fine print." Ruth felt bile rise in her throat. The hallway seemed to tilt around her, and she had to place her palm against the wall to steady herself. "And after that? After that, you'll have legal control over the assets. We can start liquidating some of the properties. Move the money into accounts that generate better returns. Your grandmother can stay in the house, obviously. We're not monsters. But she won't have to worry about managing all that wealth anymore. What about when she asks questions? You explain that you're handling it for her. That it's complicated business stuff she doesn't need to worry about. Eventually, we might need to consider a nice assisted living facility, somewhere with activities and people her age. She'd probably be happier anyway, instead of rattling around in this big house all alone." Ruth's legs felt weak. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor among the scattered groceries, a can of black beans against her hip, celery stalks spilling from a torn bag. "I still feel weird about it," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's done everything for me, Sophia, everything. When my parents died, she could have let me go into foster care. Instead, she took me in, raised me like her own son. She paid for my college, bought me a car, never asked for anything in return. And that's exactly why this isn't wrong." Sophia's voice grew more insistent. "She did all that because she loves you. This is just making sure you get what you deserve a little earlier. Think about it, Marcus. What are you supposed to do right now? You graduated with a business degree, but every entry-level job wants experience you don't have. Meanwhile, your grandmother is sitting on a fortune that could set us up for life." "Us? Of course, us. We're gonna get married eventually, aren't we? This is our future we're talking about." Ruth closed her eyes, trying to process what she was hearing. The Marcus in that room, calculating, entitled, dismissive, bore no resemblance to the boy she'd raised. Or perhaps it did, and she'd simply been too blind to see it. "Sometimes I get so tired of playing the grateful grandson," Marcus said, and Ruth heard him moving around the room. "Acting like I'm just so thankful for everything. When really, this is all stuff I should have had anyway if my parents hadn't died. It's not like she's doing me some huge favor. It's just what happened. Exactly. And now you're 22 years old, living in your grandmother's house, financially dependent on someone who still treats you like you're 8. That's not normal, Marcus. Most guys our age are independent, making their own decisions about money and life. Yeah, I know. And it's not like she's going to live forever anyway. We're just accelerating the timeline a little. The casual cruelty of the statement made Ruth gasp audibly. She clapped her hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The voices in the bedroom stopped abruptly. "Did you hear something?" Sofia whispered. Ruth forced herself to stand, her joints protesting after sitting on the hard floor. Moving as quietly as possible, she gathered the scattered groceries, her hands shaking as she tried to stuff them back into the bags. Her heart was beating so loudly she was certain they would hear it. "Probably just the house settling," Marcus said after a moment. "These old places make noise." Ruth made it to the kitchen just as she heard the bedroom door open. "Nana?" Marcus called out. "You home?" She stood at the kitchen counter, gripping its edge so hard her knuckles went white. The grocery bags sat before her, but she couldn't remember putting them there. "In the kitchen, Mijo," she managed to call back, surprised at how normal her voice sounded. Marcus appeared in the doorway, Sofia close behind him. To Ruth's eyes, they looked exactly the same as they had that morning. Marcus with his easy smile, and Sofia with her perfectly applied makeup. But now she could see the performance in it. The way Marcus's grin seemed just a little too bright, the way Sofia's hand rested possessively on his arm. "You're home early," Marcus observed, moving to the refrigerator and pulling out a bottle of water. "Everything okay?" "Construction on Camelback," Ruth said, focusing on unpacking groceries to avoid looking at them directly. "I thought you had job interviews today." "I did. Finished earlier than expected." Marcus took a long drink of water, and Ruth noticed he didn't elaborate on how the interviews had gone. "Sofia's shift got canceled, so we've just been hanging out." "That's nice." Ruth's hands trembled as she placed the coffee in the pantry. Roberto's brand. The one she bought every week, even though she was the only one who drank it now. "I was thinking," Marcus said, his tone casual, "maybe this weekend we could sit down and go over some of your financial stuff? You know, just to make sure everything's organized and up to date. With tax season coming up and all." Ruth's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "My financial stuff?" "Nothing major," Marcus assured her, that practiced smile never wavering. "Just want to make sure you're not missing out on any deductions or investment opportunities. I learned a lot about portfolio management in school." "That's very thoughtful of you, Mijo." Ruth turned to face them, studying Marcus's face. The face she'd kissed goodnight for 14 years, the face she'd worried over during every fever and celebrated with at every milestone. "But I have an accountant for taxes. And your grandfather always said the best investment was the one you understood." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, too quick for Ruth to identify. "Frustration? Impatience?" "Of course," he said. "I just thought, well, maybe grandfather's approach was a little old-fashioned. There are new strategies now, ways to make money work harder." Sofia stepped forward, her smile warm and concerned. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of, Mrs. Vasquez. Marcus worries about you managing everything on your own." The false sympathy in Sofia's voice made Ruth's stomach churn. She thought of what she'd overheard, the discussion of assisted living facilities, the casual dismissal of her intelligence, the cold calculation behind every word. "I appreciate that," Ruth said carefully, "but I'm managing just fine." Marcus and Sofia exchanged a glance that Ruth pretended not to notice. "Of course you are," Marcus said quickly. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise. We just care about you, that's all." Ruth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched as they left the kitchen, Marcus's hand on Sofia's back, their heads already bent together in whispered conversation. When she was certain they were gone, she sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her legs finally giving out completely. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves had been poisoned by what she'd overheard. Every family photo, Every shared meal, every moment of pride she'd felt in Marcus's accomplishments, all of it was now tainted by the knowledge of his true feelings. She looked around the kitchen where she'd prepared thousands of meals, where she'd helped Marcus with homework at the scarred wooden table, where she'd held him while he cried for his parents in those first terrible months after the accident. The memories felt like artifacts from someone else's life now, beautiful but no longer real. Ruth closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat in the silence of her kitchen, surrounded by the groceries she'd bought to make a family dinner for people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their future wealth. The pozole would go unmade tonight. Ruth wasn't sure she would ever feel like cooking again. Ruth's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel of her Honda Civic, the engine ticking in the afternoon heat as she sat in the parking lot of St. Augustine Catholic Church. 20 minutes had passed since she'd fled her own home, leaving Marcus and Sofia none the wiser to her discovery, but her heart still hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. The church rose before her like a sanctuary carved from adobe dreams, its bell tower reaching toward the cloudless Arizona sky. She'd been coming here for 33 years, ever since Father Rodriguez had welcomed her and Roberto with open arms despite their broken English and empty pockets. Now Father Miguel Santos presided over the same congregation, ministering to families like hers, families caught between the old world and the new, between tradition and survival. Ruth closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. The groceries sat forgotten in her back seat, the ice cream probably melting into soup by now. She'd driven here on instinct, her hands turning the wheel toward this place of refuge without conscious thought. But now that she was here, she wasn't sure she could make her legs carry her inside. The betrayal sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and unforgiving. Every word she'd overheard played on an endless loop in her mind. She was supposed to do those things. We're just accelerating the timeline a little. She won't have to worry about managing all that wealth anymore. A tap on her passenger window made her jump. Father Miguel stood beside her car, his weathered face creased with concern. Even in the heat, he wore his black shirt and white collar, though she could see perspiration beading on his forehead. "Ruth?" His voice was muffled through the glass. "Estás bien?" She rolled down the window and the desert air rushed in like an oven's breath. "Padre Miguel," she managed, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "You've been sitting here for quite some time," he said gently. "I was heading back from the hospital when I saw your car. Is everything all right?" Ruth looked into his kind eyes, eyes that had seen her through Roberto's funeral, through the dark months when grief had threatened to swallow her whole, through Marcus's teenage years when she'd worried she wasn't enough to guide a growing boy. If anyone would understand, it would be Miguel. "I need to talk to someone," she whispered. "Someone who understands about family." Father Miguel nodded without hesitation. "Come, let's get out of this heat." The church's interior offered blessed relief from the scorching afternoon. The familiar sense of incense and old wood enveloped Ruth like an embrace, and she breathed deeply for the first time since overhearing that conversation. Afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the worn wooden pews where 3 generations of families had sought comfort and guidance. Father Miguel led her not to the confessional, but to a small sitting area near the altar, where 2 comfortable chairs faced each other. It was where he conducted his counseling sessions, where families came to talk through their struggles, away from the formal structure of confession. "Now then," he said as they settled into the chairs, "tell me what's troubling you." The words stuck in Ruth's throat. How could she begin to explain the devastation of the last hour? How could she voice the unspeakable truth that the boy she'd raised, the young man she'd sacrificed everything for, saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to his inheritance? "It's Marcus," she finally managed, and then the floodgates opened. The story poured out of her, in a mixture of English and Spanish, her carefully maintained composure cracking as she relived every terrible moment. Father Miguel listened in silence, his expression growing graver with each revelation. When she reached the part about assisted living facilities, about Marcus's resentment at having to play the grateful grandson, her voice broke entirely. "Ay Dios mío," she whispered, covering her face with her hands. ¿Qué hice mal, padre? Where did I go wrong with him? Father Miguel leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Ruth, look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his. This is not your failure. Do you hear me? This is not something you caused. But I must have, she insisted. I raised him. I taught him everything I knew about right and wrong, about family, about respect. And yet he speaks of me like I'm some burden, some old woman who's outlived her usefulness. You taught him well, Father Miguel said. I've watched that boy grow up in this church. I've seen the way he looked at you with love and gratitude, the way he spoke about your sacrifices. Something else has influenced this change in him. Sofia, Ruth said bitterly, that girl has poison in her heart. But Marcus, she shook her head. He chose to listen. He chose to participate. Those were his words coming out of his mouth, not hers. Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he considered her words. Tell me, he said finally, what do you know about Sofia's background? Her family? Very little, Ruth admitted. She says she's from a good family in Colombia, but they don't speak much about them. Marcus mentioned once that they had some kind of falling out, that Sofia came to Phoenix to start fresh. And how long have they been together? About 8 months. They met at the university. Ruth twisted her hands in her lap. At first, I was happy Marcus had found someone. He'd been so focused on his studies, he rarely dated. But lately… She trailed off, remembering the subtle changes she'd noticed but dismissed. What have you noticed? Small things. The way she looks around the house like she's cataloging everything. Questions about Roberto's business, about our finances. And Marcus has been different too. More distant, more impatient with my stories about the old days. Ruth's voice grew thick with unshed tears. I thought it was just him growing up, becoming a man. I didn't realize he was learning to see me as expendable. Father Miguel reached across and took her hand in his weathered one. Ruth, I'm going to share something with you that I don't often discuss. My own father went through something similar when I was in my 20s. Ruth looked up in surprise. Miguel rarely spoke about his personal life. My grandfather had built a small but successful restaurant business here in Phoenix. When he died, he left everything to my father, his only child. But my father's brothers, my uncles, they felt they deserved a share of the inheritance. They convinced my younger cousin that my father was mismanaging the money, that he was being selfish by not sharing the wealth. Miguel's grip on her hand tightened slightly. My cousin, who my father had helped raise after his own father's death, began plotting with my uncles to force my father to sell the restaurants and divide the proceeds. They told him lies about my father's intentions, poisoned his mind with talk of fairness and family obligation. What happened? Ruth whispered. My father discovered their plan when he overheard a conversation much like the one you heard today. The betrayal nearly destroyed him, but it also opened his eyes to something he'd been too loving to see, that he'd enabled their sense of entitlement by never setting boundaries, never requiring them to earn what they received. Ruth felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. And your cousin? My father offered him a choice. He could continue down the path of deception and lose his place in the family entirely, or he could take responsibility for his actions and work to earn back the trust he'd broken. It was one of the hardest things my father ever did. He loved my cousin like a son. Quote, did it work? Father Miguel's expression was complicated. Partially. My cousin chose accountability, but it took years to rebuild what was broken. Some things, once said, can never be unsaid. Some betrayals leave permanent scars, but they did find their way back to each other, eventually. Ruth absorbed this story, feeling both comforted and terrified by its implications. So you think there's hope for Marcus? I think, Miguel said carefully, that people can change when they face real consequences for their actions. But I also think you need to protect yourself and honor Roberto's legacy while giving Marcus the chance to choose who he wants to be. At the mention of Roberto, Ruth felt fresh tears well up. I keep thinking about what Roberto would say. He loved Marcus so much, was so proud when we were granted guardianship. He had such plans for the business, for passing down everything we'd built. What kind of plans? Ruth was quiet for a moment, remembering conversations she'd tried to forget in her grief. Roberto always said the money was just a tool, that the real inheritance was the values, the work ethic, the commitment to family and community. He wanted to create something that would help other families like ours. Scholarships, maybe, or programs for young people. And have you pursued those plans? No, Ruth admitted. After he died, I was so overwhelmed with grief, and then with raising Marcus, that I just let everything sit. The business is managed by our accountants. The properties generate income, but Roberto's bigger vision. She shrugged helplessly. I didn't know how to carry it forward alone. Father Miguel leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps this crisis is showing you that you're not meant to carry it forward alone. But maybe Marcus isn't the partner Roberto envisioned. What do you mean? I mean that you have other family members who share Roberto's values. Carmen, for instance. Isabella. Even Bobby Silva. I've watched that young man grow up, and he has the heart Roberto would have recognized. Ruth blinked in surprise. She'd been so focused on Marcus as Roberto's heir that she'd forgotten about the extended family who had also been shaped by Roberto's influence. But Marcus is his grandson, she protested. Blood family. Blood makes you related, Miguel said gently, but behavior makes you family. Roberto understood that distinction. It's why he and your brother-in-law never reconciled after the incident with the loan money. Ruth remembered that painful episode, Roberto's refusal to lend money to her brother-in-law for what turned out to be a gambling debt, and the ugly accusations that followed. Roberto had been heartbroken but firm. Family doesn't enable family to destroy themselves. So what do I do? Ruth asked, feeling older and more tired than she had since Roberto's funeral. How do I handle this without destroying what's left of our family? First, Miguel said, you protect yourself. You can't make good decisions about Marcus's future if you're vulnerable to his schemes. That means talking to Carmen about legal protections, maybe even bringing in outside help to understand exactly what Sofia has been researching about your assets. Ruth nodded, though the thought of involving Carmen in this mess made her stomach clench. Second, Miguel continued, you need to understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. This Sofia, her background troubles me. The sophistication of their planning, the forged documents Marcus mentioned, this sounds like more than just a greedy girlfriend's influence. You think there's more to it? I think young women who seduce wealthy men's heirs for money rarely operate alone. I think you need to find out exactly who Sofia Restrepo is and what she's really after. Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. And then? Then you give Marcus a chance to choose, but only after you've protected yourself and Roberto's legacy from whatever damage he might do while making that choice. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the late afternoon light shifting across the altar as the sun moved lower in the sky. Ruth felt some of the crushing weight in her chest beginning to ease, replaced by something that might have been determination. Padre, she said finally, will you pray with me? For wisdom, and for strength to do what's right instead of what's easy? Miguel smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she'd seen from him since arriving. It would be my honor. As they bowed their heads together in the hushed sanctuary, Ruth felt Roberto's presence like a gentle hand on her shoulder. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. And she wouldn't let his legacy, their legacy, be destroyed by those who valued money more than the love and sacrifice it represented. The sun was beginning to set as Ruth finally made her way back to her car, Father Miguel's words echoing in her mind. People can change when they face real consequences for their actions. It was time to find out what kind of man Marcus would choose to be when faced with the consequences of his betrayal. But first, she had phone calls to make and documents to review. Roberto's study awaited her, along with the papers she'd avoided examining since his death. If Sofia had been researching their assets, it was time Ruth understood exactly what she was protecting. The drive home felt different somehow, not like a retreat, but like a warrior returning to reclaim her territory. The drive home felt different somehow, not like a retreat, but like a warrior returning to reclaim her territory. Ruth's hands no longer trembled on the steering wheel as she pulled into her driveway, and she noticed with grim satisfaction that Marcus's car was gone. Good. She needed time alone with Roberto's papers, time to understand exactly what Sofia had been researching about their assets. The house felt different too, as if Father Miguel's words had shifted something fundamental in the air. Where this morning every familiar object had felt like a monument to her naivete, now they seemed like evidence of a life well lived, evidence worth protecting. Ruth paused in the entryway, listening. The house was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of her neighbor's sprinklers. Marcus and Sofia were truly gone, probably out celebrating their successful manipulation of the foolish old woman. The thought should have hurt, but instead it fueled a growing flame of righteous anger in her chest. She walked through the living room, past the family photos that now seemed less like painful reminders and more like witnesses to the truth, evidence of the love and sacrifice Marcus was so ready to dismiss. The wedding photo of her and Roberto, young and hopeful in their best clothes outside the courthouse. Roberto with baby Marcus at the hospital, tears in his eyes as he held his grandson for the first time. Marcus's high school graduation, flanked by the two people who had shaped his entire world. At the end of the hallway stood the door she'd avoided for 5 years. Roberto's study had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd planned construction projects, managed their growing investments, and dreamed about the future they were building together. After his death, Ruth had closed the door and tried to pretend the room didn't exist. Their accountant managed the properties and investments, sending her monthly reports she barely glanced at. It had been easier to live off Roberto's life insurance and Social Security than to face the overwhelming complexity of the empire they'd built together. Now, standing before that closed door, Ruth understood that her avoidance had been a luxury she could no longer afford. The brass doorknob was warm under her palm as she turned it for the first time since the week after Roberto's funeral. The room exhaled 5 years of stagnant air and memories as she stepped inside. Everything was exactly as Roberto had left it. His reading glasses still sat on the massive oak desk he'd built himself in their garage 20 years ago. His coffee mug, the one with World's Best Abuelo that Marcus had given him for Christmas, sat beside a stack of papers, a brown ring staining the wood where condensation had dried years ago. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, bookshelves, and framed photographs, documenting the growth of Vasquez construction, from a pickup truck and tool belt to one of Phoenix's most respected family-owned companies. Ruth's throat tightened as she breathed in the lingering scent of Roberto's cologne mixed with the leather of his desk chair. For a moment, she could almost see him there, glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed blueprints or calculated profit margins with the same careful precision he brought to everything. "What would you tell me to do, mi amor?" she whispered to the empty room. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As if in answer, her eyes fell on a framed photo she'd forgotten about. Roberto and Marcus building a treehouse in their backyard when Marcus was 12. Both of them were grinning at the camera, their faces streaked with sawdust and sweat, Roberto's arm around his grandson's shoulders. It had been Marcus's idea. A project to distract him during a particularly difficult period when memories of his parents hit especially hard. Roberto had spent weeks working with him, teaching him to measure twice and cut once, to take pride in work done right. The real inheritance was the values, she remembered telling Father Miguel. The work ethic, the commitment to family and community. Ruth moved to Roberto's desk and sat in his chair, feeling small in the space where he'd loomed so large. The first drawer opened with a squeak of protest, revealing the organized chaos she remembered. Rubber bands, paper clips, business cards from subcontractors and suppliers, and a collection of small notebooks where Roberto had jotted down ideas and observations. The second drawer held financial documents, bank statements, tax returns, and investment reports that looked far more complex than anything she'd seen in the monthly summaries their accountants sent. Ruth spread them across the desk, trying to make sense of the numbers. The picture that emerged made her breath catch in her throat. Vasquez construction wasn't just successful, it was extraordinarily successful. The monthly reports she'd been receiving covered only a fraction of their holdings. There were properties throughout Phoenix she'd never heard of, investment accounts generating income she never saw, and business partnerships that extended far beyond residential construction. A commercial development in Scottsdale, a shopping center in Tempe, apartment complexes in 3 different neighborhoods, stock portfolios, bond funds, and investment real estate that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, money that was apparently being reinvested automatically under the accountant's management. Ruth stared at the papers spread before her, trying to comprehend the scope of what Roberto had built. They weren't just comfortable. They were wealthy beyond anything she'd imagined. No wonder Sofia's research had uncovered quote, discrepancies. The public records would show only a fraction of their holdings, and the complex corporate structures Roberto had established to protect their assets would make the true extent of their wealth invisible to casual investigation. But how much did Marcus know? His comments about hidden wealth suggested Sofia had found enough to whet their appetite. But these documents suggested the reality was far beyond whatever they'd discovered. Ruth opened the 3rd drawer and froze. Inside was a stack of envelopes addressed to her in Roberto's distinctive handwriting, each one marked with a different date: their wedding anniversary, her birthday, Christmas, the anniversary of Marcus coming to live with them. Letters he'd written, but never given her. With trembling fingers, she opened the most recent one, dated just 2 months before his death. Am I querida Ruth? If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are finally looking through these papers I always meant to organize better. I hope you are not too angry with me for keeping so much from you. I never wanted to burden you with the business side of our life, when you were already carrying so much with Marcus and the house and everything else. But now you need to know the truth about what we built together. The numbers in these files represent more than money. They represent the dreams we had when we first came to Phoenix with nothing but hope and each other. Every property we bought, every investment we made, I was thinking about the future. Not just our future, but the future of our family and our community. I know you think I spoiled Marcus, and maybe I did, but I also know that boy has a good heart underneath all the confusion of growing up without his parents. The money we have accumulated, it should be a tool for building character, not a substitute for it. I have been thinking about this a lot lately, especially since my last visit to Dr. Martinez. Do not be angry that I didn't tell you about the heart problems. I didn't want you to worry while we still had time together. I want to establish a foundation, something that will help families like ours. Scholarships for kids who have lost parents. Programs to teach young people about business and construction. Maybe even affordable housing for working families. Marcus should be part of this, but only if he understands that privilege comes with responsibility. Money without values is just paper. I hope by the time you read this, he has grown into the man I know he can be. Look in the safe behind the painting of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The combination is your birthday and mine, 071503228. There are more documents there, and some things I have been saving for the right time. I love you more than all the buildings we constructed together, more than all the money in all these accounts. You were my greatest success, mi amor. Now you must decide what our legacy will be. Para siempre tuyo. Roberto. Ruth's hands shook as she folded the letter. Roberto had known. Somehow, he'd known that this moment would come, that she would need guidance from beyond the grave about how to handle the wealth they'd accumulated and the family they'd raised. The painting hung on the wall behind his desk, a reproduction of the famous image of Our Lady of Guadalupe that Roberto's mother had given them as a wedding gift. Ruth had never noticed how it seemed slightly crooked, hadn't realized it was hiding a wall safe. Her fingers fumbled with the combination, July 15th and March 28th, their birthdays. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing another world of documents and surprises. Corporate papers establishing the Roberto and Ruth Vasquez Family Foundation, already legally structured but never activated. Detailed plans for scholarship programs, job training initiatives, and affordable housing projects. Financial projections showing how their wealth could generate sustainable funding for community programs for decades to come. And at the bottom, a small wooden box containing something that made Ruth gasp aloud. Inside were 2 rings. Not wedding rings, but class rings from a trade school Roberto had never mentioned attending. One was his, engraved with his name and graduation year, 1974. The other was smaller, clearly meant for a woman, engraved simply, Para Ruth, con amor, R. A folded paper beneath the rings explained. Roberto had been secretly taking business and accounting classes for years before his death, preparing to expand their company and establish the foundation. The second ring was meant to be a surprise for Ruth's 70th birthday, a symbol of her partnership and everything they'd built, recognition that she deserved graduation honors for the business education she'd gained through 3 decades of marriage to an entrepreneur. Ruth slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. For the first time since overhearing Marcus's betrayal, she smiled. Roberto had seen this day coming. Not the specific betrayal, perhaps, but the moment when she would need to step into his role as protector of their legacy. He'd prepared her as best he could, leaving her not just wealth but wisdom, not just money, but a mission. She thought about Marcus and Sofia in his bedroom, plotting to manipulate documents and pressure her into signing away assets they couldn't even imagine the scope of. They thought they were scheming against a helpless old woman. Instead, they were about to discover they'd targeted a formidable businesswoman who had simply been sleeping. Ruth began organizing the documents, creating piles for different aspects of their holdings. As she worked, Roberto's presence seemed to fill the room, guiding her hands and steadying her resolve. By the time she finished, 3 hours had passed, and she had a complete picture of their empire and a plan for protecting it. The foundation paperwork alone would allow her to shelter significant assets while pursuing Roberto's vision of community investment. But first, she needed legal counsel from someone she trusted completely. Ruth picked up Roberto's old rotary phone. He'd refused to replace it, claiming new phones were too complicated, and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Carmen? It's Tia, Ruth. I need you to come over tonight if you can. We need to talk about the family business." As she hung up the phone, Ruth caught her reflection in the glass covering one of Roberto's business awards. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the devastated grandmother who had fled her house that afternoon. This woman had steel in her spine and fire in her eyes. Marcus and Sofia thought they were inheriting money. They were about to learn the difference between stealing from a victim and trying to defraud a formidable opponent who finally understood the true scope of what she was fighting to protect. The evening air was beginning to cool when Ruth heard Marcus's car in the driveway. She remained in Roberto's study, surrounded by the evidence of their real legacy, waiting. Let them wonder where she was. Let them worry about the change they would surely sense in the house's atmosphere. Tomorrow, the real education would begin, for all of them. Carmen Vasquez Chen arrived at Ruth's house precisely at 7:30, her black Lexus pulling into the driveway with the punctuality that had made her one of Phoenix's most sought-after family attorneys. Ruth watched from Roberto's study window as her niece gathered her briefcase and laptop bag, moving with the efficient grace of someone who understood that time was money, a lesson Roberto would have appreciated. At 45, Carmen had inherited the Vasquez determination, along with Roberto's dark eyes and Ruth's stubborn chin. She'd also inherited something else, a fierce loyalty to family that had been forged in the crucible of her own parents' early death, and Ruth's decision to help fund her education rather than let grief derail a brilliant mind. Ruth met her at the front door, noting how Carmen's sharp gaze immediately assessed her aunt's demeanor. The devastated woman who had called 3 hours ago was gone, replaced by someone Carmen had never quite seen before, someone who carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had just remembered her own power. "Tia," Carmen said, embracing Ruth with genuine warmth before stepping back to study her face. "You sounded different on the phone. What's happening?" "Come," Ruth said, leading her toward the kitchen. "I'll make coffee. We have much to discuss." The kitchen felt like neutral territory after the intensity of Roberto's study. Ruth moved through the familiar ritual of preparing café de olla, the cinnamon-spiced coffee Roberto had loved, while Carmen settled at the wooden table where she'd done homework as a child during the summers Ruth and Roberto had watched her. "Before we begin," Ruth said, placing a steaming mug before her niece, "I need you to understand this conversation is confidential. Attorney-client privilege, but also family loyalty." Carmen's eyebrows rose slightly. She pulled a yellow legal pad from her briefcase with practiced efficiency. "Of course. What's this about?" Ruth took a sip of her coffee, tasting memories along with the cinnamon. It's about Marcus. And money. And betrayal that goes deeper than I imagined possible. The story poured out more easily this time, each detail sharp and clear in Ruth's memory. Carmen listened without interruption, her pen moving steadily across the legal pad, but Ruth could see the shock and anger building in her niece's expression as the scope of Marcus and Sofia's deception became clear. When Ruth finished with the discovery of Roberto's letters and the foundation documents, Carmen set down her pen and stared at her aunt in amazement. "Tia Ruth," she said slowly, "I knew Uncle Roberto was successful, but do you realize what you're describing? The asset portfolio alone puts you in the top 1% of wealth in Arizona. And this foundation structure, it's brilliant. Whoever helped Roberto design this knew exactly what they were doing." "There's more," Ruth said, and handed Carmen the business card she'd found in Roberto's safe. "Harrison, Chen and Associates. Estate planning and corporate law." Carmen's eyes widened as she read the card. "James Harrison is one of the most respected estate attorneys in the Southwest. He usually only works with clients who have assets in the tens of millions." She looked up at Ruth with new understanding. Uncle Roberto wasn't just successful. He was extraordinarily wealthy, and he was smart enough to get the best legal protection money could buy. Which means Marcus and Sofia have no idea what they're actually trying to steal. The foundation structure alone would make it nearly impossible for them to access the majority of your assets, even if they managed to manipulate you into signing documents. Roberto protected you and his legacy better than they could possibly imagine. Ruth felt a surge of gratitude toward her late husband's foresight, but Carmen's next words brought her back to the immediate danger. "But that doesn't mean they can't do significant damage while trying," Carmen continued. "If Sofia has been researching your assets, she's probably identified the properties and accounts that aren't protected by the foundation structure. That could still be millions of dollars, depending on how much Roberto had time to transfer before his death." A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Ruth and Carmen exchanged glances. Neither was expecting anyone. "I'll get it," Ruth said. But Carmen stood as well, her protective instincts activated. Through the peephole, Ruth saw a familiar face that made her smile for the first time in hours. Bobby Silva stood on her front porch, his work clothes dusty from a construction site, his expression troubled. "Bobby," Ruth said as she opened the door, "what brings you here so late?" "Mrs. V," Bobby said, his voice carrying the same respectful tone he'd used since he was 8 years old. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to talk to you about Marcus. And about his girlfriend." Ruth exchanged another meaningful look with Carmen. "Come in, Mijo. I think you arrived at exactly the right time." Bobby's presence filled the kitchen with the honest smell of sawdust and honest work. At 24, he'd grown into the kind of man Roberto would have recognized. Calloused hands, straight spine, and eyes that met yours directly when he spoke. Ruth had watched him transform from the hungry kid whose family she'd helped with groceries and odd jobs into a construction foreman who commanded respect from men twice his age. "Bobby," Ruth said, gesturing to the chair across from Carmen, "this is my niece Carmen. She's a lawyer, and she's helping me with some family business." Bobby nodded politely to Carmen before turning back to Ruth. "Mrs. V, I don't know how to say this without sounding like I'm talking bad about my friend, but I'm worried about Marcus. Real worried." "What kind of worried?" Carmen asked, her attorney instincts engaging. Bobby ran his hands through his dark hair, clearly struggling with the conflict between loyalty and truth. "Look, Marcus and I grew up together. You know that, Mrs. V. We were like brothers. But lately," he shook his head, "he's been asking weird questions about your finances, about the business Mr. Roberto left behind, and that girlfriend of his." "Sofia," Ruth said quietly. "Yeah, Sofia. She's been asking questions too, but not the kind of questions someone asks because they care about family. More like the kind of questions my cousin Miguel asked when he was trying to figure out if our grandmother's house was worth stealing." Carmen leaned forward intently. "What kind of questions specifically?" Bobby's discomfort was obvious, but he pressed on. "She wanted to know about property taxes on this house, about whether Mrs. V owned other properties, She asked me if I knew anything about Mr. Roberto's business partnerships, about whether there were any, He looked embarrassed. Any offshore accounts or hidden assets. Ruth felt ice form in her stomach. Sofia's research had been more thorough than she'd realized. There's more, Bobby continued reluctantly. Sofia's been talking to people. People who work in real estate, in banking. She told someone at the title company where my girlfriend works that she was doing research for a family genealogy project, but she was asking about property transfers and ownership records for the Vasquez family. Carmen's pen moved rapidly across her legal pad. How long has this been going on? At least 3 months that I know of, Bobby said. Maybe longer. And Marcus? He looked directly at Ruth, pain evident in his eyes. Mrs. V, Marcus has been bragging about how he's going to inherit everything, about how he's going to modernize the business, maybe sell some properties and invest in tech stocks or cryptocurrency. He talks about you like... Bobby's voice trailed off. Like what, Mijo? Like you're already gone? Bobby said quietly. Like you're this sweet old lady who doesn't understand modern finances, who needs him to take care of everything for you. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Bobby's words settling over the kitchen like a shroud. There's something else, Bobby said finally. I didn't know if I should tell you, but after what I heard today... He took a deep breath. Sofia's been meeting with some guy, older dude, drives expensive car. I saw them at that coffee shop on Camelback last week, and they were looking at papers, pointing at something on a laptop. When Marcus asked her about it later, she said it was about a job interview, but... Bobby shrugged. Didn't look like any job interview I've ever seen. Carmen and Ruth exchanged glances loaded with meaning. This was confirmation of their worst fears. Sofia wasn't operating alone. Bobby, Carmen said carefully, would you recognize this man if you saw him again? Yeah, definitely. Tall, white guy, maybe 50-something. Expensive suit, fancy watch. Looked like a lawyer or a businessman. Could you describe him to a sketch artist if necessary? Bobby's eyes widened as he realized the implications of the question. Mrs. V, what's going on? Is Marcus in some kind of trouble? Ruth reached across the table and took Bobby's work-roughened hand in hers. Bobby, what I'm about to tell you must stay between us for now. Can you promise me that? Of course, Mrs. V. You know I'd do anything for you. Ruth looked into the eyes of the young man she'd watched grow from a struggling child into an honorable adult and saw everything Marcus could have been if different choices had been made. Marcus and Sofia are planning to steal my inheritance, she said simply. They think I'm too old and trusting to protect myself. They have no idea that I know about their plans, or that I understand far more about Roberto's business than they imagine. Bobby's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, sad understanding. That's why Sofia's been asking all those questions. That's why Marcus has been acting so weird around you. Yes, and you want me to help stop them. Ruth squeezed his hand. I want you to help me save Marcus from making the biggest mistake of his life. Because once he crosses certain lines, Bobby, there may be no way back for him. Bobby was quiet for a long moment, staring down at their joined hands. When he looked up, Ruth saw Roberto's sense of justice burning in his dark eyes. What do you need me to do? Carmen leaned forward. First, we need you to keep acting normal around Marcus. Don't let him know we're aware of their plans. But if you can find out more about Sofia's meetings, especially with this mystery man, that would be extremely helpful. I can do that, Bobby said. Marcus still trusts me. He doesn't know I've figured out what they're planning. Second, Ruth added, I need you to understand that this may get complicated. Sofia and this man she's working with, they may be part of something bigger than just family greed. We may need to involve the police. Bobby nodded grimly. My grandmother always said that stealing from family is the worst kind of sin because it breaks the bonds that hold us all together. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Ruth said. As they continued planning, Ruth felt something she hadn't experienced since Roberto's death, the strength that came from being part of a team united by shared values. Carmen brought legal expertise and strategic thinking. Bobby brought youth, energy, and intimate knowledge of Marcus's recent behavior. Together, they were formidable. But as the evening deepened and they refined their plans, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. Sofia's sophistication, her apparent connections to people with legal and financial expertise, suggested this was more than opportunistic greed. Whatever they were facing, it was bigger than any of them had initially realized. And somewhere out there, Marcus was being drawn deeper into a web that might ultimately destroy everything Roberto had built and everything Ruth had sacrificed to preserve. The real battle for the family's soul was just beginning. Part 5. The Performance of Normalcy. The next morning arrived with the relentless heat that made Phoenix summers legendary, but Ruth felt ice in her veins as she prepared breakfast in her kitchen. The familiar rhythm of cracking eggs and buttering toast felt like performing in a play where she knew the other actors were about to betray her character, but she had to maintain her role until the final curtain. Marcus appeared in the doorway at exactly 8:15, as punctual as he'd been since childhood. But now Ruth noticed things she'd missed before. The way his eyes swept the kitchen, cataloging and assessing rather than simply seeing home. The slight calculation in his smile as he kissed her cheek and murmured, "Buenos dias, Nana." "Good morning, mijo," she replied, proud that her voice carried the same warmth it always had. "I made your favorites, huevos rancheros, and fresh tortillas." "You spoil me," Marcus said, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. The words that once would have made Ruth's heart swell now felt like sandpaper against her ears. She was supposed to do those things. Sofia's voice echoed in her memory. Ruth placed the plate before him and watched as he took his first bite, noting how he barely looked at the food that had taken her an hour to prepare from scratch. When had he stopped appreciating these small acts of love? When had breakfast become an expectation rather than a gift? "Where's Sofia this morning?" Ruth asked, settling across from him with her own modest portion. "Still sleeping. Late night," Marcus said around a mouthful of eggs. "She's been stressed about work lately." Ruth doubted Sofia's part-time boutique job could generate much stress, but she simply nodded sympathetically. "It's hard when young people are trying to establish themselves. I remember when your grandfather and I first started the business. Every day felt like we were fighting for survival." Something flickered across Marcus's expression. Guilt, perhaps, or impatience with another story about the old days. "Yeah, things were different then," he said dismissively. "The economy, opportunities, everything." "Different how?" Ruth asked, genuinely curious about how Marcus viewed their history. Marcus set down his fork, and Ruth saw an opportunity in his willingness to engage. "Well, you guys came here when Phoenix was small, when you could buy land for nothing and build a business without much competition. Now everything's corporate, regulated, expensive. It's harder for people our age to get ahead." Ruth nodded thoughtfully, filing away his perspective. "So you think we were just lucky?" "Not lucky exactly," Marcus said, backtracking slightly. "You worked hard. But you also had timing on your side. The right place at the right time. The right place at the right time." Ruth wondered if Marcus understood that success required recognizing opportunities and having the courage to seize them, not simply being present when good things happened. But she kept her expression neutral, encouraging. "That's an interesting way to look at it," she said. "I suppose every generation faces different challenges." "Exactly." Marcus seemed pleased that she understood his point, which is why I think it's important for your generation to help our generation get established, you know? Share the opportunities. There it was. The setup Sofia had coached him to deliver. Ruth felt a surge of sad admiration for how smoothly he'd steered the conversation toward their agenda. "What kind of sharing did you have in mind?" she asked innocently. Marcus's eyes brightened with what Ruth now recognized as predatory enthusiasm. "Well, I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday, helping you organize your finances. Maybe we could sit down this weekend and really look at everything. Make sure you're maximizing your investments, taking advantage of new opportunities." "That's very thoughtful of you, Mijo." Ruth's smile felt like a mask, but she wore it perfectly. "Though I should mention, I spent some time yesterday reviewing Roberto's papers. I'd forgotten how complex our affairs had become. Marcus leaned forward, and Ruth saw naked interest replace his casual concern. Complex how? Oh, you know how your grandfather was. Very thorough, very organized. Multiple accounts, various investments, property holdings I'd completely forgotten about. Ruth watched Marcus's pupils dilate slightly at the mention of forgotten properties. I'm not sure I understand half of it myself. That's exactly why you need help, Marcus said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone Ruth had begun to recognize. These financial instruments can be confusing for people who aren't familiar with modern investment strategies. Ruth bit back the urge to remind him that she'd been managing money since before he was born, that she'd helped build the very fortune he was plotting to steal. Instead, she nodded helplessly. You're probably right, though I did find something interesting. Your grandfather apparently established some kind of foundation. Papers with very official-looking seals and everything. Marcus went very still. A foundation? I think so, though I couldn't make sense of all the legal language. Ruth waved her hand dismissively. Probably just some tax thing he set up with the accountants. Right, Marcus said, but Ruth could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Did you, mention this to anyone? The accountant, maybe? Not yet. I thought I'd wait until you could help me understand it all. Ruth stood to clear the plates, noting how Marcus's gaze followed her movements with new intensity. Though I should probably call Carmen soon. She always understood Roberto's business side better than I did. Carmen? Marcus's voice carried a note of alarm. Why would you involve Carmen? Ruth paused in loading the dishwasher, as if surprised by his reaction. She's family, Mijo. And she's a lawyer. I thought she might help me understand what Roberto was trying to accomplish with all these complicated documents. I just think. Marcus caught himself, moderating his tone. I mean, Carmen's great, but she specializes in family law, not estate planning. You might get better advice from someone who specifically handles investment portfolios. Someone like who? Sofia actually knows someone who specializes in estate optimization. We could ask him to take a look, maybe give you a second opinion before involving Carmen. Ruth felt her blood chill. Sofia's mysterious accomplice, no doubt. That's very kind of Sofia to offer, though I'd hate to impose on her contacts. It's not an imposition at all, Marcus said quickly. We care about you, Nana. We want to make sure you're protected. The word protected, coming from someone planning to defraud her, was almost too much to bear, but Ruth maintained her grateful smile. Well, perhaps this weekend then, she said. Though I promised Dr. Morrison I'd have lunch with her today. She's been so lonely since her husband passed. Ruth watched Marcus file away this information. Another person in Ruth's life to account for. Another potential obstacle to their plans. That's nice, he said absently. Dr. Morrison's always been good to you. As if summoned by their conversation, the doorbell rang. Through the kitchen window, Ruth could see her neighbor's familiar silver hair. That's probably her now, Ruth said. She mentioned wanting to borrow my recipe for Roberto's favorite flan. Ruth opened the front door to find Dr. Helen Morrison holding a small potted plant, her intelligent eyes immediately assessing Ruth's demeanor with the same clinical precision she'd once brought to her psychology practice. Good morning, Ruth, Helen said warmly. I brought you a cutting from my jade plant. I thought it might brighten your kitchen windowsill. How thoughtful, Ruth said, accepting the plant and noting how Helen's gaze moved past her toward the kitchen where Marcus was presumably still finishing his breakfast. Please, come in. I was just telling Marcus about our lunch plans. Helen followed Ruth into the kitchen, her presence immediately changing the room's dynamic. At 67, Helen Morrison carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades analyzing human behavior, and Ruth noticed how Marcus's posture shifted in response to her arrival. Hello, Marcus, Helen said pleasantly. How are you settling into post-graduation life? Fine, thank you, Dr. Morrison, Marcus replied, but Ruth caught the slight tension in his voice. Helen had always been able to see through his childhood performances, and apparently that skill hadn't diminished with retirement. Any job prospects? Helen continued. settling at the kitchen table with the ease of someone who had been part of the family's extended circle for years. "A few things in the works," Marcus said vaguely. "The market's pretty competitive right now." "I imagine it is," Helen agreed. "Though I've always found that young people with strong family support tend to navigate these transitions more successfully. You're fortunate to have Ruth in your corner." Ruth watched this exchange with growing appreciation for Helen's subtle interrogation technique. Without seeming to probe, she was establishing Marcus's current dependence on Ruth, while observing his responses. "Yeah, Nana's been amazing," Marcus said, his gratitude sounding rehearsed now that Ruth knew the truth behind it. "And Sofia?" Helen asked. "How is she adjusting to Phoenix? It can be challenging for young people from other places to establish themselves here." Marcus's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "She's doing well. Actually, she's been really helpful with some business stuff, helping Nana organize her finances and paperwork." Helen's eyebrows rose slightly, and Ruth caught the sharp look her neighbor directed her way. How generous of her to offer. That's quite an undertaking for someone so young. "Sofia's very mature for her age," Marcus said defensively. "She comes from a business background, so she understands financial management." "I see," Helen said neutrally, but Ruth could see the psychologist's mind cataloging Marcus's defensive responses and protective attitude toward Sofia. The front door opened with a jingle of keys, and Sofia's voice called out from the entryway. "Marcus? I'm back from the store." Ruth watched Marcus's entire demeanor change as Sofia entered the kitchen, his shoulders relaxing, his smile becoming more genuine, as if her presence activated some part of him that remained authentic. "Good morning, Mrs. Vasquez," Sofia said brightly, then nodded politely to Helen. "Dr. Morrison, isn't it? Marcus has mentioned you." "Yes, we're neighbors," Helen replied, her tone pleasant, but her eyes sharp as she studied Sofia's perfectly applied makeup and designer clothes. Expensive choices for someone working part-time retail. "Sofia's been such a help to me," Ruth said, playing her role perfectly. "Marcus tells me you have experience with financial management?" Sofia's smile widened, and Ruth saw predatory satisfaction in her eyes. "Some experience, yes. My family was involved in import-export business in Colombia, so I grew up understanding international finance and investment strategies." "How interesting," Helen said. "Import-export can be quite complex. What kind of products did your family handle?" For just a moment, Sofia's confidence flickered. "Various things," she said vaguely. "Agricultural products, mainly. Coffee, textiles, that sort of thing." Ruth filed away Sofia's evasive response while maintaining her interested expression. Helen, she noted, was doing the same, her psychologist's training evident in how she processed Sofia's micro-expressions and verbal hesitations. "Well," Sofia continued, recovering her composure, "I should let you ladies enjoy your visit. Marcus, maybe we could run those errands we discussed." Marcus stood immediately, and Ruth noticed how he deferred to Sofia's suggestion without question. Whatever hold she had over him, it was powerful and complete. "Of course," he said. "Nana, we'll see you later. Enjoy your lunch with Dr. Morrison." As they gathered their things to leave, Ruth caught Sofia studying the kitchen with the same assessing gaze she'd noticed in Marcus, cataloging, evaluating, planning. When Sofia's eyes lingered on the drawer where Ruth kept important papers, she felt a chill of recognition. They were already planning their next move. After Marcus and Sofia left, Helen remained seated at the kitchen table, her expression troubled. "Ruth," she said carefully, "I hope you don't mind my saying this, but something about that young woman concerns me." Ruth met her friend's eyes, seeing professional worry mixed with personal concern. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that comes from 30 years of studying manipulative behavior patterns," Helen said bluntly. The way she inserted herself into the conversation about your finances, the vague responses about her background, the way Marcus defers to her judgment, these are classic indicators of someone who specializes in exploiting trust relationships. Ruth felt relief flood through her at having her instincts confirmed by someone with Helen's expertise. "I've been having similar concerns," she admitted. "Have you considered that this might be more than just a gold digger situation?" Helen asked gently. Because what I observed this morning suggests someone with experience in financial manipulation, possibly professional experience. As Ruth processed Helen's words, she realized that the performance of normalcy she'd been maintaining was about to become much more difficult. If Helen could see through Sofia's facade so easily, how long before Sofia realized that Ruth was no longer the trusting victim they'd assumed her to be? The afternoon stretched ahead, loaded with the promise of revelation and the threat of discovery. Ruth's carefully maintained act was about to be tested in ways she hadn't anticipated, and the stakes were rising with each passing hour. The afternoon stretched ahead, loaded with the promise of revelation and the threat of discovery. Ruth's carefully maintained act was about to be tested in ways she hadn't anticipated, and the stakes were rising with each passing hour. Ruth spent her lunch with Helen Morrison in a state of heightened awareness, every nerve ending attuned to the possibility that Marcus and Sofia might return early and discover their conversation. But Helen's professional insights proved invaluable, offering Ruth a framework for understanding the psychological manipulation she'd witnessed. What you described, the way Sofia positioned herself as helpful while simultaneously undermining your confidence in your own abilities, that's textbook predatory behavior, Helen explained over their salads at the small cafe near Ruth's neighborhood. And Marcus's sudden interest in organizing your finances, combined with his dismissive attitude toward your business acumen, suggests he's been systematically conditioned to see you as incompetent. Ruth absorbed this analysis while maintaining the appearance of a casual lunch between neighbors. How long does that kind of conditioning usually take? Months, typically. It's not something that happens overnight. Helen's expression was troubled. Ruth, I think you need to consider that Sofia may have been planning this from the moment she met Marcus. Young men from wealthy families often become targets for sophisticated con artists. When Ruth returned home at 3 o'clock, the house felt different, charged with an electricity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Marcus's car was in the driveway, but the house was oddly quiet. No television, no music, no conversation drifting from his room. Ruth moved through the front hallway with careful steps, listening. The silence felt deliberate, almost staged. She was about to call out when she heard Sofia's voice from the direction of Roberto's study. Told you, she went through the papers yesterday. We need to move faster than we planned. Ruth's blood turned to ice water. They were in Roberto's study, the sanctuary she'd reclaimed just yesterday, the room where she'd discovered the foundation documents and Roberto's letters. Her hands trembled as she set down her purse and moved silently toward the back of the house. I know, but rushing will make her suspicious. Marcus's voice carried a note of frustration. She's already talking about calling Carmen. Then we stop her from calling Carmen, Sofia said with cold practicality. Look, Marcus, this is what my contact was talking about. Old people start getting paranoid about their finances, start involving other family members who complicate everything. We have a narrow window here. Ruth pressed herself against the hallway wall, just out of sight of the study doorway. Through the gap, she could see Sofia sitting at Roberto's desk, her desk now, with papers spread before her. The violation of that sacred space made Ruth's vision blur with rage. What exactly are you suggesting? Marcus asked. I'm suggesting we present her with a fait accompli. Tomorrow morning, bright and early, we sit her down with these documents and explain that we've already arranged for the consultation with my contact. We make it seem like an appointment that's already scheduled, something she can't politely refuse. Ruth saw Marcus lean over Sofia's shoulder to examine the papers on the desk. Those look different from what we discussed before. They are different. After what you told me about the foundation documents she found, my contact revised everything. These new papers essentially override any previous estate planning by establishing you as her financial power of attorney with immediate effect. Immediate effect? Marcus's voice carried uncertainty. That seems pretty drastic. Marcus. Sofia's voice took on the patient tone of a teacher explaining something to a slow student. Your grandmother is 72 years old. At that age, cognitive decline can happen rapidly. These documents simply ensure that if something does happen to her mental capacity, you're legally positioned to protect her assets. Ruth felt sick listening to Sofia's twisted logic, but she forced herself to remain still and listen. And if she refuses to sign? Then we move to Plan B. Sofia's voice grew colder. We document instances of her confusion, her inability to manage complex financial matters. Dr. Morrison is a retired psychologist. We get her to express concerns about your grandmother's capacity. Build a case for competency evaluation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You want me to have my grandmother declared mentally incompetent? I want you to protect your inheritance before she gives it all away to the church or some ridiculous charity. Sofia snapped. Do you have any idea how much money we're talking about? I ran the property searches last night. This family is worth at least $15 million. Probably more. Ruth's gasp was audible even to her own ears, but Sofia and Marcus were too absorbed in their plotting to notice. 15 million? Marcus's voice was strangled. At minimum. And that's just what I can identify through public records. If she really has foundation documents, if your grandfather set up trusts or offshore accounts, we could be looking at double that. The numbers hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Ruth pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the casual way they discussed stealing her life's work, Roberto's legacy, everything they'd built together. My contact can handle the whole thing, Sofia continued. Legal challenges, competency proceedings, asset transfers. For a percentage, obviously, but think about it, Marcus. Even if we have to give him 30%, we're still talking about more money than most people see in a lifetime. 30% seems like a lot, Marcus said weakly. It's the cost of doing business. And it's temporary. Once we have control of the assets, once your grandmother is safely tucked away somewhere nice, we can renegotiate our arrangement with him. Ruth felt the world tilt around her. They weren't just planning to steal her money, they were planning to have her committed, to erase her from her own life entirely. The cruelty of it took her breath away. I don't know about the competency thing, Marcus said. It feels what? Like you're protecting someone who's clearly losing her ability to make rational decisions? Marcus, yesterday she couldn't even understand basic investment terminology. She admitted she doesn't comprehend the foundation documents your grandfather left. That's not normal for someone who was supposedly involved in running a business. Ruth realized with horror that her careful performance of confusion had been used as evidence against her. Every question she'd asked, every moment of feigned helplessness, had been catalogued as proof of her incapacity. Look, Sofia continued, I know this seems harsh, but we're actually doing her a favor. Assisted living facilities are wonderful these days. Activities, social interaction, professional medical care. She'll be happier there than rattling around in this big house with all these responsibilities she can't handle anymore. And if she fights it, then we have documentation from multiple sources about her declining capacity. Her own grandson expressing concern about her ability to manage her affairs. Her neighbor, a trained psychologist, noting concerning behaviors. The family lawyer will have to recommend what's best for her protection. Ruth felt trapped in a nightmare. They had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. They were going to destroy her life with surgical precision, and they genuinely seemed to believe they were justified in doing so. When do we start? Marcus asked, and Ruth heard the final death of the boy she'd raised in those 4 words. Tomorrow morning. I'll call my contact tonight and confirm the appointment. We present this to your grandmother as a routine consultation about optimizing her estate planning. Once she signs the initial documents, everything else becomes automatic. Ruth heard chairs scraping against the floor. They were preparing to leave the study. She moved quickly but quietly toward the kitchen, her mind racing. She needed evidence, needed proof of what she'd overheard. But more than that, she needed help. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, Carmen's number already programmed into speed dial. But before she could complete the call, she heard Sofia's voice from the hallway. Oh, Mrs. Vasquez, you're back early. How is lunch with Dr. Morrison? Ruth spun around to find Sofia standing in the kitchen doorway, her expression perfectly pleasant, as if she hadn't just spent the last 20 minutes planning Ruth's financial destruction and institutionalization. Lovely, thank you, Ruth managed, praying her voice sounded normal. Helen sends her regards. That's wonderful, Sofia said, moving closer. Marcus and I were just looking at some materials for tomorrow's consultation. We're so excited to help you get everything organized. The casual way Sofia referenced their planned ambush made Ruth's stomach churn, but she forced herself to smile. That's very thoughtful of you both. We were thinking maybe we could sit down tonight and go over some preliminary questions, Sofia continued. Just to make sure we're prepared for the meeting. Ruth realized this was it, the moment when her performance would either hold or crumble entirely. Sofia was studying her face with predatory intensity, looking for any sign that Ruth suspected their true intentions. Of course, Ruth said, moving to the refrigerator as if nothing had changed. Though I should mention, I called Carmen this afternoon. I thought she might want to join us for the consultation tomorrow. The silence that followed was deafening. Ruth kept her back turned, arranging items in the refrigerator that didn't need arranging, while the temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carmen? Sofia's voice was carefully controlled. Why would you involve Carmen? Ruth turned around, her expression innocently confused. She's family, dear, and she understands legal documents better than I do. I thought she could help me ask the right questions. Sofia's smile had become a rigid mask. Of course, though as I mentioned before, estate optimization isn't really her specialty. We wouldn't want to waste her time on technical matters she might not understand. Oh, I'm sure she'll be happy to learn, Ruth said pleasantly. Carmen's always been interested in family business. Quote, Ruth watched Sofia's mind working behind her eyes, recalculating, revising strategy. This wasn't part of their plan, and Sofia clearly didn't like variables she couldn't control. Well, Sofia said finally, perhaps we should confirm the appointment time with your consultant first. Make sure it works with Carmen's schedule. What a good idea, Ruth agreed. I'll call her right now and see what works best for her. As Ruth reached for her phone, she caught a glimpse of Sofia's expression in the reflection of the kitchen window. The mask had slipped entirely, revealing something cold and calculating that made Ruth's blood freeze. Whatever game they'd been playing was about to become something far more dangerous, and Ruth was no longer sure her performance could protect her from what was coming next. The evening ahead promised to be the most crucial of her life, and possibly the most perilous. The evening ahead promised to be the most crucial of her life, and possibly the most perilous. But Ruth Vasquez had not survived 47 years in Phoenix, built a construction empire from nothing, and raised a grieving child into adulthood by backing down when the stakes were highest. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Ruth's living room had been transformed into an arena of judgment. She had chosen this space deliberately, the same room where she'd celebrated Marcus's graduations, where Roberto had taught him to play chess, where family traditions had been passed down for 14 years. If Marcus was going to betray everything this room represented, he would do so surrounded by the evidence of all the love he was destroying. Carmen sat in Roberto's old reading chair, her briefcase open on the side table, legal documents arranged with military precision. Detective Ray Morales occupied the sofa, his presence both reassuring and ominous, a reminder that this had moved beyond family drama into criminal territory. Father Miguel had positioned himself near the window, morning light creating a halo effect that seemed fitting for the spiritual reckoning about to unfold. Ruth herself sat facing the room's entrance, her back straight with the posture Roberto had always admired. She wore the navy blue dress she'd chosen for important business meetings, and Roberto's mother's rosary was wrapped around her wrist, a reminder of the generations of strong women who had prepared her for this moment. The sound of Marcus's key in the front door sent a jolt of electricity through the assembled group. Ruth heard Sofia's voice in the entryway, bright and confident as she commented on what a beautiful morning it was for, quote, getting Mrs. Vasquez's affairs organized. Marcus appeared in the living room doorway first, his smile faltering as he took in the unexpected assembly. Sofia stepped up beside him, and Ruth watched her face cycle through confusion, alarm, and finally, cold calculation as she assessed the situation. Nana? Marcus's voice carried a note of uncertainty. What's going on? I thought we were meeting with Sofia's consultant this morning. We are having a consultation, Ruth said calmly. Please, both of you, sit down. Sofia's hand found Marcus's arm, her grip tight enough that Ruth could see her knuckles whiten. "Mrs. Vasquez, there seems to be some confusion. We had arranged for a private meeting with my financial advisor." "Yes, I heard about your arrangements," Ruth said, her voice carrying a steel edge that made Marcus flinch. "I heard quite a lot about your plans, actually." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sofia's mask of pleasant helpfulness slipped completely, revealing the predator beneath. "I'm not sure what you think you heard," Sofia began, but Carmen interrupted with the crisp authority of a prosecutor. "Sofia Restrepo, also known as Sofia Mendoza, also known as Sofia Rodriguez," Carmen said, reading from a document. "Currently wanted for questioning in connection with elder fraud cases in 3 states, including a scheme in Nevada that netted over $2 million from vulnerable seniors." Sofia's face went pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I don't know what you're talking about. My name is Sofia Restrepo, and I've never been to Nevada." Detective Morales spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years in law enforcement. "We have fingerprints, Ms. Mendoza. We have witness statements. We have bank records showing deposits from the sale of property belonging to elderly victims who signed documents they didn't understand." Marcus looked back and forth between Sofia and the detective, confusion and dawning horror warring in his expression. "What are you talking about? Sofia's never been involved in anything criminal." "Your girlfriend," Ruth said quietly, "is a professional con artist who specializes in manipulating families like ours. The consultant you were supposed to meet with this morning is her partner, a man who creates fraudulent legal documents and identity theft schemes targeting wealthy seniors." "That's ridiculous," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ruth could see him remembering details that hadn't made sense before: Sofia's expensive clothes despite her part-time job, her intimate knowledge of estate planning despite her claimed background in import-export, her reluctance to discuss her family. Sofia's composure cracked completely. "You have no proof of anything," she snarled, her cultured accent slipping to reveal something harder and more desperate underneath. "And even if you did, Marcus is an adult who made his own choices. Nobody forced him to do anything." "You're right," Ruth said, turning to face her grandson directly. "Nobody forced Marcus to participate in your scheme. He chose to plot against the woman who raised him. He chose to plan my institutionalization. He chose to see my love as weakness and my trust as stupidity." Marcus's face crumpled as if he'd been physically struck. "Nana, we weren't going to hurt you. We just wanted to make sure you were taken care of." "By having me declared mentally incompetent?" Ruth's voice carried decades of hurt and disappointment. "By stealing the legacy your grandfather died building? By erasing me from my own life so you could spend money you never earned?" "It wasn't supposed to be like that," Marcus whispered, tears starting to flow down his cheeks. Sofia said what she needed to say to turn you into her accomplice," Detective Morales interrupted. "That's how these operations work. They find young men from wealthy families, seduce them, then convince them that stealing from their own relatives is somehow justified." Father Miguel spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with sadness. "Marcus, I baptized you in this community. I watched you grow up in these pews. How did you convince yourself that this was acceptable?" Marcus collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. I don't know how it got this far. At first, it just seemed like we were trying to help Nana manage her money better. Then Sofia started talking about how she was getting older, how she might make poor decisions if we didn't intervene. And then you started believing I was the problem instead of the person who loved you most," Ruth finished quietly. The room fell silent, except for Marcus's quiet sobbing. Sofia stood rigid, her eyes darting between the exits as if calculating her chances of escape. Carmen spoke into the silence. "Ms. Mendoza, you have 2 choices. You can cooperate with Detective Morales' investigation, provide information about your partner and other potential victims, and face charges in Arizona. Or you can remain silent and face federal charges when this gets turned over to the FBI's Elder Fraud Task Force." "And Marcus?" Sofia asked, her voice sharp with malice. "What happens to your precious grandson who was so eager to steal from his grandmother?" Ruth looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw past the scheming young man to the broken 8-year-old who had cried in her arms after his parents' funeral. The boy who had learned to see love as transaction, care as obligation, family as resource to be managed. Marcus has a choice too, Ruth said finally. He can take responsibility for what he's done, make restitution for the damage he's caused, and begin the long work of earning back the trust he's destroyed. Or he can continue down the path he's chosen and face the consequences of betraying his family. Marcus looked up at her through his tears, and Ruth saw something she hadn't glimpsed in months. Genuine remorse mixed with desperate hope. "What would restitution look like?" he asked quietly. "It would look like accountability," Carmen answered. "Full cooperation with the investigation. Community service, counseling to understand how you were manipulated. And earning your place back in this family through actions, not words. And if I do all that?" Ruth felt Roberto's presence in the room as strongly as if he were sitting beside her. "Then we find out who you really choose to be, Mijo, the man your grandfather believed you could become, or the stranger who was willing to destroy everything we built together." Sofia's laugh was bitter and cold. How touching. The family reunion complete with forgiveness and redemption. Well, I'm not interested in your little moral theater. I want a lawyer. Detective Morales stood, reaching for his handcuffs. "Sofia Mendoza, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder fraud, identity theft, and attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult." As the detective read Sofia her rights, Ruth watched Marcus's face cycle through shock, grief, and what might have been relief. The woman who had poisoned his judgment was finally being removed from his life, but the choices he had made remained his to own. The confrontation was over, but Ruth knew the real work, the painstaking reconstruction of trust and family bonds, was just beginning. Some betrayals left permanent scars, but love, she had learned, was stronger than the damage it survived. As Sofia was led away in handcuffs, Ruth reached across the space between them and took her grandson's hand. It was calloused from recent construction work, she noticed, perhaps the first honest labor he'd done in months. "We have a lot of work ahead of us," she said quietly. Marcus squeezed her hand, his grip desperate and grateful. "I want to try, Nana. I want to be better than what I became." "Then we start tomorrow," Ruth said. "Today, we grieve what was lost. Tomorrow, we begin building what comes next." The house felt different in the silence that followed Sofia's arrest. Ruth sat in her living room, still wearing the navy dress she'd chosen for the confrontation, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through the windows. The same light had illuminated this room for 37 years, but everything else had fundamentally changed. Marcus hadn't moved from his chair since Detective Morales had led Sofia away in handcuffs. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief, from the recognition of how completely he had lost himself. Carmen and Father Miguel had stayed, forming a semicircle of watchful support around the broken young man who was trying to find his way back to being Ruth's grandson. "She's gone," Marcus whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "She's really gone." "Yes," Ruth said gently, "and now we find out who you are without her influence." The words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise. Marcus raised his head to look at his grandmother, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, with the devastation of recognizing his own betrayal. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted. "When I think about the things I said, the things I planned. Nana, how did I become someone who could plot against you? How did I convince myself that was okay?" Father Miguel leaned forward, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had counseled countless souls through their darkest moments. "Evil rarely announces itself, Marcus. It whispers. It justifies. It makes the unthinkable seem reasonable, one small compromise at a time." "But I should have known better," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "You raised me better than that. Abuelo taught me better than that. I knew the difference between right and wrong, and I chose wrong anyway." Ruth studied her grandson's face, searching for signs of genuine remorse versus self-pity. She'd learned to recognize the difference during his teenage years, when consequences for poor choices had been measured in grounded weekends rather than destroyed family bonds. This felt different, deeper, more authentic than his usual charm when caught in wrongdoing. "Knowing and choosing are two different things," Ruth said carefully. "The question now is what you choose going forward." Carmen cleared her throat, bringing the conversation back to practical realities. Marcus, I need you to understand the legal situation you're facing. While Detective Morales focused on Sofia today, you were an active participant in a conspiracy to commit elder fraud. The documents you helped prepare, the plans you made, these constitute serious crimes. Marcus went pale. Am I going to be arrested? That depends, Carmen said, her tone professional but not unkind. On several factors. Your cooperation with the investigation, your willingness to make restitution, the degree to which the prosecutor believes you were manipulated versus being a willing participant. What would cooperation look like? Detective Morales had left his card, and Ruth could see Marcus glancing toward it on the coffee table. The choice to reach for help or retreat into denial would define everything that came next. Full disclosure about Sofia's activities, her associates, her methods, Carmen explained. Testimony about how she recruited you, what she told you about other potential victims. Anything that could help law enforcement protect other families from what you almost did to ours. Marcus nodded slowly. She mentioned other situations, other families she'd helped with estate planning. I thought she was just trying to establish credibility, but now you realize she was bragging about previous victims, Ruth finished. The weight of that realization settled over Marcus like a physical burden. He had been part of a machine designed to prey on elderly people, to steal not just their money but their dignity, their independence, their right to age in their own homes, surrounded by their own choices. There's something else you need to understand, Ruth said, rising from her chair and moving to Roberto's old desk in the corner of the living room. She returned with a folder thick with documents. Sofia wasn't just trying to steal part of our money, Marcus. She was trying to steal our legacy. Ruth opened the folder to reveal the foundation paperwork Roberto had prepared, the community investment plans, the scholarship programs designed to help families like theirs. Your grandfather didn't just build wealth, Mijo. He built a vision for how that wealth could strengthen our community for generations. Marcus stared at the documents as if seeing them for the first time, which in many ways, he was. I never knew about any of this. Because you never asked, Ruth said, not unkindly but without sugarcoating the truth. You assumed inheritance meant receiving money, not inheriting responsibility. You thought legacy was about what you could take, not what you could give. Father Miguel spoke into the heavy silence. Your grandfather understood something that takes most people a lifetime to learn. That wealth without purpose becomes a burden, not a blessing. Money that isn't used to lift others eventually weighs down the person who hoards it. Is that why he never told me about how much we had? Marcus asked. Because he didn't trust me with it? Ruth considered the question carefully. Roberto's letters had been clear about his hopes for Marcus, but also about his concerns. He wanted you to understand the value of work before you understood the value of wealth. He wanted you to earn the right to inherit responsibility along with money. And instead, I tried to steal both. Instead, Ruth said gently, you let someone convince you that you were entitled to something you hadn't earned. But Marcus, the fact that you're here now, that you're asking these questions instead of running away, that tells me Roberto's faith in you wasn't misplaced. Carmen looked up from the notes she'd been taking. Ruth, what are you thinking in terms of consequences? Because the legal system is going to want answers, and the family needs to present a united front about how we're handling this. Ruth had been thinking about this question since the moment she'd overheard Marcus and Sofia plotting. Justice and mercy weren't opposing forces. They were dance partners in the delicate choreography of healing. I want Marcus to face real consequences, she said. Not because I want to punish him, but because he needs to understand the weight of what he almost destroyed. I want him to work, actual physical labor, to understand how Roberto built what he tried to steal. I want him to meet with other families who've been victims of schemes like Sofia's, to see the real damage these crimes cause. Marcus nodded eagerly. I'll do whatever you want, Nana. Anything to make this right. But I also want him to be part of implementing Roberto's vision, Ruth continued. Under supervision, with accountability, earning his way back into the family trust. Because punishment without purpose is just cruelty, and Roberto didn't build this legacy to see it destroyed by either greed or vindictiveness. Father Miguel smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Roberto would be proud of that wisdom. "There's one more thing," Ruth said, reaching into the folder and pulling out a smaller envelope. "Marcus, your grandfather wrote you a letter. He gave it to me before he died, with instructions to give it to you when you became a man. I was waiting for your 25th birthday, but I think maybe manhood isn't about age. Maybe it's about the moment you choose to take responsibility for your actions." Marcus's hands trembled as he accepted the envelope. His name was written across it in Roberto's careful script, and Ruth could see tears forming in his eyes as he recognized the handwriting. "Should I read it now?" "That's your choice," Ruth said. "But remember, once you read it, you'll know what your grandfather really thought about legacy, about family, about the kind of man he hoped you'd become. You can't unknow that truth." Marcus looked around the room at the three people who were offering him a chance at redemption. Carmen with her legal expertise and protective instincts, Father Miguel with his spiritual guidance and hard-won wisdom about forgiveness, Ruth with her love that was strong enough to demand accountability alongside mercy. "I want to know," he said quietly, opening the envelope with careful fingers. As Marcus read Roberto's final words to him, Ruth felt her late husband's presence filling the room like sunlight after a storm. Whatever Roberto had written, whatever wisdom he'd tried to impart, would either provide the foundation for Marcus's redemption or illuminate just how far he'd fallen from the path his grandfather had hoped he'd take. The afternoon was giving way to evening, and Ruth knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Legal proceedings to navigate, community service to arrange. The slow, patient work of rebuilding, trust one honest action at a time. But for the first time since overhearing that devastating conversation, Ruth felt hope stirring in her chest. Not the naive hope of someone who hadn't learned hard truths about human nature, but the tempered hope of someone who understood that people could change when they faced real consequences and were offered genuine chances at redemption. Marcus finished reading the letter and looked up at his grandmother with eyes that held something Ruth hadn't seen in months, authentic remorse mixed with determined resolve. "Abuelo believed I could be better than what I became," he said quietly. "He believed I could be worthy of this family's legacy. I want to prove him right, even if it takes the rest of my life." "Then we start tomorrow," Ruth said, echoing the words she'd spoken at the end of the confrontation. "Today we grieve what was lost. Tomorrow we begin building what comes next." But as the sun set over Phoenix, painting the desert sky in shades of redemption and possibility, Ruth allowed herself to believe that the hardest part was behind them. The real work of healing could finally begin. Part 9. Rebuilding and Redefinition. 6 months later, Ruth stood in the early morning light of the Vasquez Family Foundation headquarters, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Phoenix awakened to another day of possibility. The modest building in central Phoenix had once been a furniture warehouse, but Roberto's construction plans, discovered in his files, had envisioned its transformation into something far more meaningful. Now it housed computer labs for job training, classrooms for financial literacy education, and offices where families could receive counseling about estate planning and elder care. The irony wasn't lost on Ruth that a building meant to protect families from financial exploitation had been funded by money that Sofia and Marcus had tried to steal. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest good emerged from the ashes of the deepest betrayals. "Mrs. Vasquez?" Isabella's voice broke through Ruth's contemplation. At 17, Carmen's daughter had grown into a poised young woman who carried herself with the confidence of someone who understood her place in a larger story. "The scholarship recipients are here for the ceremony." Ruth smiled at her great niece, noting how Isabella had inherited the Vasquez determination, along with Carmen's sharp intellect. "How do they look?" "Nervous, excited, grateful." Isabella's expression grew thoughtful. "A lot like Marcus did at his first scholarship presentation, actually." Through the window, Ruth could see the construction crew arriving for their shift at the affordable housing project across the street. Another piece of Roberto's vision taking physical form. Among the workers, she spotted Marcus's familiar figure, his hard hat already in place, his lunch cooler slung over his shoulder like the other men who had learned to earn their daily bread through honest labor. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, Those first weeks after Sofia's arrest had been brutal, filled with legal proceedings, media attention, and the complicated work of rebuilding trust within a family that had been shattered by betrayal. Marcus had faced criminal charges, ultimately reduced to community service and restitution in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation that had led to the arrest of Sofia's partner and the recovery of assets stolen from other families. But the legal consequences had been the easy part. The harder work had been watching Marcus confront the man he'd allowed himself to become, and then slowly, painfully, honestly, begin building the man he wanted to be instead. The counseling helped, Ruth had told Father Miguel just last week. But I think the construction work helped more. There's something about building things with your hands that grounds a person in reality. Marcus had started as the lowest man on Bobby Silva's crew, mixing concrete and hauling materials under the desert sun that showed no mercy to anyone who hadn't earned its respect. Bobby had been skeptical at first. How could he trust someone who had been willing to betray his own grandmother? But Marcus's consistent presence, his willingness to take on the dirtiest jobs without complaint, and his genuine humility had gradually earned him a place among men who valued actions over words. "He's different now," Bobby had reported to Ruth after Marcus's third month on the crew. "Quieter. More thoughtful. He actually listens when people talk, instead of just waiting for his turn to speak." The construction work had been Marcus's idea, a response to Roberto's letter that had outlined the grandfather's hope that his grandson would understand the dignity of building before he inherited the responsibility of managing. Roberto had written about the satisfaction of creating something permanent, something that would shelter and serve families long after the builders had moved on to other projects. "A man who has never created anything with his own hands," Roberto had written, "cannot truly appreciate what others have built for him." Ruth had watched Marcus discover this truth through aching muscles and calloused palms, through the simple pride of framing a wall that would support a roof, of pouring a foundation that would anchor a family's dreams for generations. The entitled young man who had plotted to steal his inheritance had gradually been replaced by someone who understood that wealth meant nothing without the character to use it wisely. The scholarship ceremony began at 9 o'clock, held in the foundation's main conference room, where portraits of Roberto and Ruth flanked a mission statement written in both English and Spanish. 12 young people, most of them first-generation college students from families that reminded Ruth of her own journey to Phoenix, sat nervously in chairs facing a panel that included Carmen, Father Miguel, Dr. Helen Morrison, and several community leaders. Marcus entered quietly through the back door, still wearing his work clothes but with his hard hat respectfully removed. Ruth had asked him to attend these ceremonies not as a representative of the foundation, but as a reminder to himself of the opportunities that education and hard work could create. He took a seat in the back row, his presence both humble and intentional. As Ruth stood to address the scholarship recipients, she felt Roberto's approval like a warm hand on her shoulder. These young people, some of whom had lost parents, some of whom came from families struggling with financial instability, all of whom understood that education was a privilege earned through sacrifice, represented the true legacy Roberto had envisioned. 6 months ago, Ruth began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. This foundation existed only in my late husband's dreams and in documents I had been too afraid to examine. Today, it exists because sometimes our greatest failures teach us our most important lessons about what really matters. She glanced back at Marcus, who was listening with the focused attention he'd learned to bring to everything since Sofia's arrest. These scholarships aren't charity, they're investments. Investments in young people who understand that opportunity comes with responsibility, that education is a tool for lifting not just yourself, but your entire community. The ceremony proceeded with each recipient sharing their educational goals and their commitment to community service. Ruth listened to stories that echoed her own journey, families that had sacrificed everything for their children's futures, young people who understood that privilege required purpose, dreams tempered by the practical understanding that nothing worthwhile came without work. After the formal presentations, as families mingled over coffee and pan dulce, Ruth found herself in conversation with Maria Santos, a 19-year-old studying engineering who reminded Ruth powerfully of herself at that age, determined, practical, and carrying the hopes of an entire family on her shoulders. "Mrs. Vasquez," Maria said. "I wanted to thank you not just for the scholarship, but for the financial literacy classes. My parents never learned about investing or estate planning, and I want to make sure I can protect what I build for my own family someday." Ruth smiled, remembering her own ignorance about Roberto's business dealings, her own avoidance of financial complexity after his death. "That's exactly why those classes exist, Mija, so the next generation can be better prepared than we were. Is it true that your grandson helps teach those classes now?" Ruth glanced across the room where Marcus was indeed speaking with a group of young adults about the dangers of financial manipulation, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about how even people from loving families could be led astray by those who preyed on ignorance and entitlement. "Yes," Ruth said. "He teaches what he learned the hard way, that anyone can be a victim if they don't understand how predators operate." It had been Marcus's suggestion to include his story in the Foundation's Elder Protection Program. The idea of publicly admitting his betrayal had terrified him, but he'd recognized that his shame was less important than protecting other families from similar schemes. "Sometimes," Marcus had told Ruth, "the best way to make restitution is to make sure no one else makes the same mistakes I did." The afternoon brought Ruth to the construction site where the Foundation's first affordable housing project was taking shape. 48 units designed for working families, built with Roberto's exacting standards but priced within reach of teachers, firefighters, and construction workers, the people who made communities function but often couldn't afford to live in the places they served. Ruth walked the site with the project manager, noting the careful attention to detail that Roberto would have demanded. Energy-efficient appliances, well-insulated walls, small but thoughtfully designed spaces that would allow families to build equity while living with dignity. She found Marcus installing kitchen cabinets in one of the nearly completed units, his movements confident and precise. The work had broadened his shoulders and darkened his skin, but more importantly, it had given him something Ruth hadn't seen since his childhood: genuine pride and accomplishment earned through effort. "How's it coming?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of the cabinet door. "Good," Marcus said, not pausing in his work. "These will be ready for the family that moves in next month, a teacher and a paramedic with 2 kids. Bobby says they've been living in a 1-bedroom apartment for 3 years, saving every penny for a down payment." Ruth heard something in Marcus's voice that made her heart swell with cautious hope. Genuine satisfaction in creating something meaningful for people he would probably never meet. This was Roberto's legacy in action: wealth transformed into opportunity, money given purpose through service. "Marcus," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about your role in the Foundation." He stopped working and turned to face her, wariness and hope warring in his expression. "What kind of role?" "Not management," Ruth said quickly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on what you decide you want to do with your life. But there's a need for someone who understands construction, who can oversee projects like this one, who can make sure Roberto's vision for quality and integrity is maintained in everything we build." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his calloused hands turning a screwdriver over and over. "You'd trust me with that?" "I'd trust you to earn that trust," Ruth corrected. "Day by day, project by project, decision by decision. Trust isn't something you inherit, Mijo. It's something you build, like these houses, one piece at a time." The sun was setting over Phoenix as Ruth drove home, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of the sunsets she and Roberto had watched from their front porch during their first years in the city. The landscape had changed dramatically since then: strip malls and housing developments where orange groves used to bloom, but the essential beauty remained. Her house felt different now, too, no longer a shrine to the past but a bridge between what had been and what could be. Marcus had moved into a small apartment near the construction site, part of his commitment to independence and responsibility, but he still came for Sunday dinners, where conversation flowed more honestly than it had in years. The Foundation work filled Ruth's days with purpose she hadn't felt since Roberto's death. Every scholarship awarded, every family housed, every financial literacy class taught was a small victory against the forces that preyed on vulnerability and ignorance. Sofia's betrayal had revealed weaknesses in Ruth's defenses, but it had also awakened strengths she hadn't known she possessed. As she sat on her front porch that evening, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Ruth felt Roberto's presence more clearly than she had since his death, not as a ghost haunting her grief, but as a partner in the work that continued, a vision that had survived betrayal and emerged stronger for having been tested. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, families to serve, projects to oversee, the ongoing work of rebuilding trust with a grandson who was slowly becoming the man his grandfather had believed he could be. But tonight, Ruth allowed herself to feel something she had almost lost 6 months ago: hope for the future her family would build together. The legacy was secure, not because it was protected from those who would steal it, but because it was being lived by those who understood its true value. And that, Ruth knew, was exactly what Roberto had always intended. Part 10. Legacy secured. 2 years to the day after the confrontation that had nearly destroyed their family, Ruth stood before the Vasquez Community Center, watching 3 generations of Phoenix families gather for the dedication ceremony. The building rose from land Roberto had quietly purchased decades earlier, a piece of desert that had seemed like an odd investment at the time, but now revealed itself as part of his larger vision for community transformation. The morning air carried the familiar scent of creosote and possibility that had drawn Ruth and Roberto to Phoenix 50 years ago. But today, those aromas mixed with the sounds of children playing in the center's courtyard, the voices of families speaking in both English and Spanish, and the steady rhythm of construction equipment from the affordable housing project that had expanded to fill the entire city block. Ruth adjusted the lightweight shawl Carmen had given her, woven by artisans the foundation now supported, and smiled as she watched Marcus approach from the construction trailer where he'd been reviewing blueprints with the project engineers. At 24, he moved with the confident gait of someone who had learned to measure his worth by the quality of his work, rather than the size of his inheritance. "Ready for this, Nana?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the entitled presumption that had characterized his speech 2 years ago. The man standing before her bore little resemblance to the young man who had plotted her downfall. Construction work had broadened his frame, but more importantly, community service had broadened his perspective. "As ready as anyone can be to see 50 years of dreams made manifest," Ruth replied, reaching up to straighten his tie. He wore a simple navy suit, nothing fancy, but respectful of the occasion and the families who would benefit from what they were dedicating today. The community center represented everything Roberto had envisioned when he'd first sketched his ideas on restaurant napkins during their early years in Phoenix. Job training programs for young adults aging out of foster care, financial literacy classes for families navigating the complexities of American banking systems, legal clinics staffed by volunteers like Carmen, who had restructured her practice to spend half her time on foundation work, childcare services that allowed parents to attend evening classes without worrying about their children's safety. But perhaps most importantly, it housed the Elder Protection Program that had grown out of the family's painful experience with Sofia's manipulation. Marcus served as the program's community outreach coordinator, traveling to senior centers and community groups to share his story and teach families how to recognize the warning signs of financial predators. "I never thought I'd be grateful for making the worst mistake of my life," Marcus had told Ruth recently. "But if my stupidity helps protect other families from what I almost did to ours, then maybe some good came from all that pain." Isabella approached them now, no longer the 16-year-old observer who had watched the family drama unfold, but a poised college freshman who had spent her summer organizing the center's youth programs. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that privilege came with responsibility, a lesson Marcus had learned far later and far more painfully. "The ribbon-cutting ceremony starts in 10 minutes, Isabella announced. "Father Miguel is blessing the building, Mayor Rodriguez is speaking about community partnerships, and then Marcus gives his presentation about the construction process." Ruth nodded, pride swelling in her chest as she thought about Marcus's transformation from entitled heir to capable project manager. His presentation wouldn't just cover construction timelines and building techniques. It would tell the story of how the center had been built by people who understood that creating something meaningful required more than money. It required vision, integrity, and the willingness to work for something larger than personal gain. The dedication ceremony drew nearly 300 people, filling the center's main assembly room with faces that represented the rich diversity of Phoenix's Hispanic community. Ruth recognized many of them: scholarship recipients from the foundation's first 2 years, families who had moved into the affordable housing units, small business owners who had received microloans through the center's economic development program. But she also saw new faces, people drawn by word of mouth about services that treated recipients with dignity rather than condescension, programs designed by people who understood the challenges of building new lives in a complex society. Mayor Rodriguez spoke about public-private partnerships and community resilience, using the language of politicians who understood that the Vasquez Foundation had become a model for how private wealth could be transformed into public good. But Ruth paid more attention to the faces in the audience, particularly the elderly couples who nodded knowingly when the mayor mentioned elder protection services. Father Miguel's blessing was brief but powerful, invoking the memory of Roberto and the ongoing presence of families who had been served by the center's programs. "This building stands as proof," he said, "that our greatest struggles can become our greatest strengths when we choose love over fear, service over selfishness." When Marcus took the podium, Ruth felt Roberto's presence so strongly it was as if her late husband were standing beside her. Marcus spoke with the authority of someone who had learned hard lessons about integrity, but also with the humility of someone who understood that redemption was an ongoing process rather than a one-time event. 2 years ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the assembly room, "I was a different person living a different kind of life. I was someone who believed that inheritance was about what I could take, rather than what I could give. I was someone who confused being entitled with being worthy." Ruth watched the audience as Marcus shared his story, not the sanitized version that might have preserved his pride, but the full truth about his betrayal, Sofia's manipulation, and the family's decision to choose restoration over retribution. Several elderly audience members nodded in recognition, clearly understanding the dynamics he described from their own experiences with financial predators. "This building exists because my grandmother chose to transform our family's crisis into an opportunity to serve others," Marcus continued. "Every classroom, every program, every service offered here represents a choice to turn pain into purpose, to ensure that other families don't have to learn these lessons the way we did." As Marcus concluded his remarks, Ruth felt tears on her cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but tears of profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The scared, grieving 8-year-old who had come to live with her and Roberto had grown into a man who understood that true inheritance was about inheriting responsibility along with resources. The formal ceremony concluded with Ruth cutting the ribbon that officially opened the center, but the real celebration began afterward, as families toured the facilities and enrollment began for fall programs. Ruth moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and listening to stories about how the foundation's various programs had touched lives. Near the end of the afternoon, she found herself in conversation with Elena Martinez, a widow whose husband had died after falling victim to a scheme similar to Sofia's. Elena's story was heartbreaking: savings stolen, home lost, children scattered across the country as she struggled to rebuild her life. But she had found hope through the Foundation's elder protection and financial recovery programs. "Mrs. Vasquez," Elena said, gripping Ruth's hands with fingers gnarled by arthritis and hard work, "what you and your family have created here, it's not just a building. It's proof that good can come from bad, that families can survive betrayal and become stronger." As the sun set over Phoenix, painting the sky in the familiar shades of orange and purple that had welcomed Ruth and Roberto to the city half a century ago, the last families finally departed from the dedication ceremony. Ruth stood in the center's courtyard with Marcus, Carmen, Isabella, and Father Miguel, surrounded by the tangible evidence of Roberto's vision made real. "So what's next?" Isabella asked, her voice bright with the optimism of someone whose entire life stretched ahead like an unwritten story. Ruth smiled, feeling the weight of years and the lightness of purpose in equal measure. "Next, we continue the work. We serve more families, build more homes, teach more classes. We prove every day that this legacy is worthy of the man who dreamed it, and the community that makes it possible." Marcus nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. I want to be part of that for as long as you'll have me, Nana. Not because it's my inheritance, but because it's become my calling. Ruth took her grandson's calloused hand in hers, feeling the strength that had been built through honest work and authentic repentance. Then we continue together, Mijo. One day, one family, one choice at a time. As they walked toward their cars, Ruth allowed herself one last look at the community center, where tomorrow would bring new families seeking help, new opportunities for service, new chances to prove that love was stronger than betrayal, and that legacies were built not by what we took, but by what we gave. Roberto's vision was secure, not because it was protected from those who would steal it, but because it was being lived by those who understood its true value. And that, Ruth knew with perfect certainty, was exactly what legacy was meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote.